Well, good evening, folk. Welcome again to Weekend Winddown as we get together at the end of a weekend just to share some time together, talking about issues of life and ministry and theology and the intersect of that. I think it's been our joy through all of these sessions to just consider the fact that God has spoken, that we've got His Word, the eternal, enduring, abiding Word of God, that we lack nothing in terms of life and godliness as we come to grapple with the issues of life. And we pray that that's been helpful for you. But it's my joy this evening to welcome David Dreyer into the Winddown Lounge. We're back into the proper Winddown Lounge again for a change. And I trust that our conversation will be helpful. But David, thank you. Thanks for coming through. I trying to peg you down for when you were in Randburg. So it's probably long overdue. But as per kind of typical wind-down sessions, we like to start off just in general terms and get to know the people. And particularly if you're newer to the church, you might not have known David. He's been absent for a while, not fully AWOL. It was definitely absent with leave. We knew where you were. But let me just talk through. I mean, I think you guys arrived in Randburg at the church must have been about June, July 2005, if I remember correctly, up from De Parel in the Western Cape. Just talk us through a bit of your life and background and where you've come from and where you're going. And
okay, don't really know where I'm going. But where I'm coming from.
I can give you a compass if you really want to.
We moved up in 2005. I think this was the first church we visited when we actually moved to Randburg, and then
we still haven't got rid of you guys.
Yeah, no.
Anyway.
Collectively, kind of decided we'll just stick it out, see what happens. So then grew up basically in the church from grade 6. Started getting involved in ministry, I think, only in high school. So on the worship ministry, and some of the mission outreach and things like that. And then started getting more involved only after high school. So when starting varsity, at the end of high school, we started Blast.
You're busy with Blast?
Yes. Which was fun.
Because I think I handed over to you. I mean, when I was kind of shifting from youth ministry pastors to whatever they call me, I think you effectively took over that leadership round about then, which would have been about 2012, roughly.
Yeah, so just after high school, first year varsity. Yeah. Then 6 years med school, which also put a lot of strain on ministry involvement and church attendance. And then moved to Bloemfontein, which obviously isn't as close by as Randburg, and then came back now to Heidelberg, so ministry involvement has picked up a little bit more this year than the previous times.
Sure. Just, you mentioned med school. I remember kind of walking a bit of that road with you to a degree. I mean, there were a number of options available to you at the end of high school in terms of where to next. I know medicine was one and veterinary science was one and so forth. Just how did you settle? What was your thought process in terms of actually pegging down that medicine was the direction that you wanted to go?
I'm not sure. Initially it was veterinary science was number one. And then I applied for medicine only at Wits and veterinary sciences, I think. And then the biomedical sciences at Wits, because they said if you don't get into medicine, you can always do that and kind of bridge over. And then end of matric, which was 2011, I think Pretoria informed me first that I got in, and then kind of in December we were already on holiday. Wits is like, no, you didn't get into medicine, but you got into biomedical sciences. And I think we were in Fort Beaufort with my aunt and them, and just remembering walking the afternoon around the farm trying to think which one, ultimately deciding maybe it's better to help humans than animals. Not that I don't like animals, but I feel you can make a bigger impact if it's people. Just in their own lives and the community as well. So it kind of became easier, but you had to think about it quite a bit first. Plus the uncertainty that you might not even get into medicine.
Sure.
But just taking the chance.
I mean, we've obviously as a church walked with you as well through that season, and then got to the end of that and down to Bloem. That was the end of 2017, so I think you were there 2018, 2019. Any striking memories during your experiences there?
like initially starting, it was a bit daunting because you're not sure. Now you're actually working, so you're responsible. You can't just say, I'm a student, I don't know. So the workload increased quite significantly, the hours as well, because now you started doing proper 24 hours, 36-hour calls. The hospital itself wasn't as bad. I know people tend to talk us up to say, no, it's Pelanomi, worst hospital in the country, and flooding in theatres and things. And then you get there and it's like, kind of like every state hospital, nothing really special. Over the 2 years, it was good experience. I mean, you were exposed to a lot and you quite hands-on practical skills. And not really sure specialty-wise if there was anything that stuck out. More or less a little bit of everything from everyone. So memory-wise, it was just work. There wasn't really time to do much else because the bottom of the food chain. Even the student is better off than you. And probably not leaving work ever before 5, 6.
And you're not even a coffee drinker, right?
Well, I started.
Did you?
So,
Oh, there's progress.
Now it's kind of life juice.
Never works. But I mean, I think just for the sake of the church family, we're aware of kind of, you had a lumbar puncture that went bad at the end of 2018, December. Oh no, 2019, last year. That's right. And then, I mean, you just went through hell after that in terms of recovery. I mean, what happened? Where are you? I mean, is that making progress?
So I don't know what happens, but every time I'm in pediatrics, I get sick with something. And then it just happened to be meningitis at the beginning of December. I think it was on the 6th. And we went into hospital. I was actually on call that night. And then the consultant came and she saw, listen, he's not really doing well because he's walking like a robot because you can't move your neck. And she drove me to the emergency room at Mediclinic. And by the time I got there, it was basically stiff as a board. And then the doctor came, did the lumbar puncture. And I could feel, I mean, I've never had one, so I wasn't sure what the sensation would be like. I know it's painful because I've done it to people and they want to murder you afterwards. It wasn't like, it's not a normal pain. I don't know how to describe it in words. It was just a really weird sensation. And then he actually told me afterwards, like, ooh, it was a bit traumatic because there's blood in the tubes. And I was like, okay, I mean, it happens. You're not expecting it to be perfect every time. And it was fine the night. And then the next morning when I had to start walking, I think I walked about 10 meters and then my back just went snap. Yeah.
Sure.
Like pain, I couldn't go further just because of the pain. And he initially said, okay, but it's going to take a few days before it gets better because, I mean, we did stick a needle into your spine. And I was like, okay, we'll recover. We'll just continue with the walking every day, see if it gets better. Didn't. Went back to work. Actually fell quite a few times on calls because then I was walking with not like a hiking stick because I didn't have a crutch. And got to the point, I think, maybe around the 20th of December, even the senior told me rather just leave. Because, I mean, you can work in the day, but you can't do the calls.
Well, you're dysfunctional,
Yeah. And fortunately, I saved leave for the end of the year anyway. So it kind of just happened to coincide at the same time. But, and then coming into 2020, got worse, I think January, February, March. Probably 80% of time in a wheelchair. Like you can walk at home, but if you go out to public, you can't walk. So you're in the wheelchair. You couldn't drive at all.
So your independence is taken away.
Kind of a knock.
But no, as things stand, it's probably a bad pun. But it's you're mobile. You're functional.
I'm more functional. I would say. Pain's still there, it's more manageable. You can at least, if I drive for more than 45 minutes, I can feel you pushing it a little. Work is fine because I'm basically sitting the whole day. You only get up to examine people and you sit back again. And most of the clinics are like 5 minutes drive from where I'm staying, so that's not too bad. So overall, definite improvement, but
Sure.
yeah.
So talk us through kind of, you're now in Heidelberg, clinic work mostly, but I mean, you would have gone straight back almost into the kind of COVID season in terms of the resumption of that. Just any experiences from your side, from the coalface, in terms of just how this thing's panning out in the sector that you've been involved with?
So initially we didn't get, I mean, I only went back to work in May, so I missed that March, April period when the lockdown started. Obviously getting messages from other people working and seeing how hectic it's going. But when I went back in May, we weren't really that much different than January. I think we were a bit less patients because people are now obviously more afraid to actually come to the clinic or leave their houses. We did test quite a lot in the initial stages, but then government guidelines came saying you need to restrict who you're testing. They need to have at least 4 symptoms. There must be a history of contact with someone with COVID, or they're working in some sort of healthcare setting, be it old age homes, clinics, hospitals. So I think the numbers we were actually seeing isn't a true reflection. I'm just speaking for our clinics now. Isn't a true reflection of the actual cases we had, because we all know a lot of them are asymptomatic, so you won't even pick up that they have symptoms. Of the people I tested, I think I had about 4 that were positive, but not severe cases, so they could self-isolate at home. I don't think I've had anyone that I had to send to the hospital.
Okay.
Just the stories from the hospital, it sounded a lot worse. So I was fortunate that I was working at the clinic and not in the hospitals.
But in terms of volume of patients or severity?
I think both, because people are now scared, so they rather just go directly to the hospital and not report to the clinic first. And then we had quite a few severe cases, especially Heidelberg as well. We had quite a few spikes. Okay. ICU being the biggest issue, the availability of beds and ventilators. Yeah, but I mean, overall, I think our section of Gauteng wasn't as bad as the rest of it. Yeah.
I want to throw a question at you. So it goes to state of mind of staff, and it leads me into another question in terms of how we as a church can be maybe interacting with the medical professionals that we do have. I think as a local church, our first case in a sense was one of our folk who was a nursing sister at a private hospital who had treated a couple of patients and contracted that, was admitted, treated and discharged, and I think came of that untoward. But I just want to throw a question in terms of the state of mind typically of the healthcare providers. Could be doctors, nurses, even the paramedical fields.
Yeah.
I mean, what's the general state of mind? Is there a fear, anxiety, or are we just rolling with this?
I think initially we were kind of in adrenaline mode. So you're just thinking, okay, our numbers are going to increase drastically. We need to kind of just, manage, get people in, get people out as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Then we all started getting, I mean, fortunately I haven't had it, but a lot of the colleagues started getting sick.
Yeah.
And then the panic starts going a bit higher up. I think in terms of people who were affected the most is more the nursing staff, because they spend a lot more time with the patients than any of the other health professionals. So for them, I think there was a more real sense of fear, because they're very underappreciated to begin with. So support for them isn't that high. And now that we've got a pandemic, so they kind of knew they're fighting their own battle.
Yep, sure.
In terms of the clinics where we were, the other problem was we didn't really get PPE. So I think the most you have to bring your own mask, and then the most you would get was maybe hand sanitizer and gloves, and just to go with that. Not that we maybe expected too much from the government to begin with, but you kind of had the hope. It's in medical emergencies, so maybe they'll step up a bit, but yeah. So from our side, the nursing staff were more concerned with, not that we don't want to work, but we don't have the proper protection to even be doing the work that we are doing.
Yeah.
So.
Thanks, that's helpful. It leads me to another question. The 18th of October was designated as what was called Healthcare Sunday, and certainly within the Baptist Union of Churches. I just need to get my crib notes. And they put out a publication with some prayer guidelines in and around that, which is probably a couple of weeks ago. And I quote, here's a paragraph. 2020 was declared the year of, let's try that in English. 2020 was declared the year of the nurse and midwife by the WHO, that's World Health Organization. The 20th of May being the 200th anniversary of Florence Nightingale's birth. With this in mind, the prayer focus will be for all nurses who make up 70% of the workers on the COVID front line. Many of them are risking their lives to save others, and they desperately need our prayer and practical support. How could you do that as a congregation? So I just want to throw that at you. I mean, we didn't do anything definitive with that. We're not highly populated in terms of healthcare professionals on the coalface at our church. So there are a few. But just in terms of practical support, prayer and so forth, what guidelines should we be aware of to shape our praying? Because otherwise we're just going about it blindly.
I mean, it's a difficult question, because practically I'm not sure how you would assist, because the biggest, like I said before, the biggest thing we need is actually the equipment to keep yourself safe. And I'm not sure how the public would go about procuring anything like that to provide in a bulk scale to hospitals or clinics. I'm not sure if there's programs where they take donations to do that, not that we're aware of in the public sector anyway. I'm not sure about private. Prayer-wise, I think more just to have a sense of calm, because everything at work is just in a panic. And as soon as there's a new case coming in, everyone is just, you're scared for yourself, you're scared for your colleagues, scared for your own patients in the ward already. Plus, you've seen a lot of your colleagues either get sick, a lot of them pass away, and not getting really much support. The problem is also with any of the hospitals, so if you're not sure who is religious and who's not, I mean, people tend to think medical professionals are a little less on the religious side because you see things normal people don't get exposed to, so you kind of question a lot of faith and things like that. I must say, regarding the nursing staff, a lot more of them, I would say, tend to show some evidence of faith. Not sure in what specifically, but there's a lot more evidence among them. So prayer-wise, just to have the sense of peace when you are working, and for protection, even if we don't have the actual equipment, but I mean, you can still pray for people to be as safe as possible as you can be, and maybe for possible provision of extra measurements and things like that. But
that which is needed.
Yeah, I think the biggest support you can give is if there are healthcare workers in your church, to engage with them, to actually find out what's happening where they are working, be it public, private, because the experiences with public and private is going to be vastly different. You won't have the same accounts between the two. Maybe also just giving them an ear to vent to, because a lot of the time we don't get provided counseling or debriefing at work. So your debriefing kind of never happens, or it happens with the people in your household, which can also put a lot of stress on what's happening at home. So just kind of lending that extra
which
support.
compounds other issues in other areas. Sure. No, that's helpful. Thank you. So I think folks just hear that. I mean, it's in terms of prayer issues, David's thrown out some good challenges there, but if you're mindful of those that are on the coalface, even within our own local church or others that you know, just the ear, the hearing, and being a space to engage with and have opportunity to share. David, I just wanted to go in a different direction, well, kind of different direction, and goes back a little bit in time as well, and that's handling the, can we call it the work kind of study pressure issue? You know, we understand any of the healthcare sciences have their own particular challenges when it comes to study and the academic rigors through the 6 years of study that you would have gone through. It's not too far removed from other disciplines as well, just in different ways. I think a lot of the professions certainly have that. In terms of your own journey, I think it was commendable that as far as you could, reasonably, you were still involved, church life was still a priority, you still served, you still came, you were still singing, I think even running, in a sense, or overseeing the blast ministry during a fair chunk of your study process was... I just knew it was happening, and I could rest in that, and we weren't in panic station mode. From your experience, looking back, in terms of just practical tips for young guys, young girls that are coming out of school, getting into the tertiary study environment, irrespective of the discipline. It's not just medicine. What do you want to say? What could you say to them to just ensure that in and through the academic pressures, that spiritual life and ministry and serving the Lord and His church and so forth is still doable? How did you handle it? What do you pass the baton? Share some life wisdom.
I think the first thing to say is you must prepare that first year university, doesn't matter what degree you're doing, is not the same as high school. There's a very big gap between the pressures you're experiencing in high school compared to when you start varsity, and I don't think you get prepared enough for what you're going to actually experience. In terms of making time for things besides studying and being involved in ministry, it takes a lot of practice, I want to say. First year was a bit more tricky because you're getting used to a new kind of way of studying, and there's no more spoon feeding and things. So if you do need to read things up, you have to do it on your own. So it's a lot more stressful and a lot more difficult. So kind of it takes up the majority of your time, and then you start becoming more proficient in time management. But a lot of it takes effort. It's still a choice. You can't just say, no, but I'm in varsity now, I'm studying, I don't have time for anything else. I think you need to find the balance, which is tricky, and it's going to differ from person to person. You need the outlet. I'm not saying ministry must be used as an outlet per se. You must still do it for the right reasons and not just for stress relief. But it's still an active decision. You must make the choice. Okay, I'm going to partake. Say there's a missions outreach coming, and you're saying, I want to be part of that. To then at least know this is the date of the outreach. For me to be able to go, I must do X amount of work before that time. And then kind of just put in the effort. A lot of it is just effort, and time. Granted, you might not be able to do as much as before, but you can still be involved.
Sure.
Goes the same for social life. You can
Did you have
still, I mean, I tried.
You still got friends though.
Yeah, I do. I don't know. Yeah, they pretend maybe, but
The question is, do you pay them enough? That's
true. So time management is the biggest thing. So if you can start kind of honing in on how to do it and becoming more efficient, I don't think you'll ever be perfect at time management for anything. But if you really want to be involved, you'll find a way and you'll plan accordingly ahead. Most of the things with church, we do have set dates, or at least you know that month we're going to be doing something. So there is time to prepare beforehand on how to juggle things.
Thank you. Now that's helpful, because I think it's really helpful, because my concern is that the study period is used as an excuse. I can't possibly be involved in anything because I'm just drowning in terms of study. But my question would be, is when does it end? Okay, so then you graduate after 3 years or 4 years or 6 years, depending on the field that you're in. And then you're into the workplace, which comes with its own set of challenges. Then there's relationships and marriage and family and children, and I think, and I've tracked it with numerous folk in different areas where I can't serve the Lord now because of, but where does it end? And I think the point is to get the discipline in play early on, so that in the workplace, when you're sitting with different pressures at 30 or 40 or 50 or 60, in a sense, you've learned to juggle and actually still still honor the employer, but actually still honor the Lord in terms of you utilizing spiritual gifts and serving the church. So, spin off from that, and it goes to time management as well, I would imagine. But you're in a space, and I think the medical fields, and again, let's broaden it out from beyond just medicine. I think nursing, physio, OT, etc. Even those involved in emergency medicine, the first responders, paramedics and so forth, are going to sit with the same issues. And anybody else that's working shift work is going to sit with the challenge of regularity. I mean, we're brought up with the kind of mantra from Sunday school and camps and so forth: read your Bible, pray every day, and you'll grow, grow, grow. Not wrong.
Yeah.
I think there's a value in discipline in terms of prayer and Bible reading and spending time alone with God, devotionally and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful. And I hear testimonies from old seasoned believers who at 5:30 every morning or 6 o'clock, and they're done with their cup of tea or their coffee, and they're spending time in prayer in the Word for an hour and so forth. And that's great. That's commendable. And I think it's we applaud that and celebrate the growth in their lives. But the reality is that that's not possible for many people. The nature of work in terms of being transient, study, if you're thinking of a nursing sister working a 12-hour shift and needing to leave and travel on 2 hours on either side of that, from your experience, again, through the study process and even Bloom and now maybe Heidelberg, what do you do to keep spiritually fresh in the midst of a life that is not regular? That's probably the heart of my question.
So I think as a student, you have probably the most regular. I'm not sure about other professions after your degree, but for us, as a student, you probably had the most predictable timetable that you would have. And so it's easier to fit things into a kind of routine. I think the other thing that benefited me was Marion was on med school every Wednesday. So we did have Bible study. I think there were 3, maybe 4 of us at the med school one. So also just at least having a more seasoned Christian trying to teach you and engage with you. Specifically, I mean, she did a good job trying to engage more, knowing our background is health sciences, and trying to engage how do you apply your beliefs and what you read in the Bible to your work setting, even as a student kind of setting. So there was at least some support. Also, we had the student dinners once a month, which was also good input.
I was accused of having late night parties at the MEMS. So I was like, I'm sure there's more substance to it than that.
Well, I mean, if you study the Bible, it's always a party, isn't it?
There we go.
So as a student, it was a lot easier. I think in Bloom, once you started doing actual calls, it became a bit more difficult because it depends on how your night goes. Do you have time to read your Bible or not? Are you constantly busy during the night until the next morning? In the morning, you still have handovers, you have other things you still need to do, then you're going home, you're exhausted. For me, a big part of what I started doing was more like audio sermons and things like that. So while you're driving, you might not retain everything that you're listening to, but there's at least some source being projected at you. Praying, I think, is a bit easier than the Bible reading, because I found myself praying quite a lot, like as you're walking from where you took blood to the lab, you're not doing anything. And
vacant time.
Yeah, so just making use of the time where you have, you're still technically working, but you're not talking to anyone, so you might as well pray. Same with driving. It's easy to just pray in the car as well.
Yep.
I find my prayer has become more of a kind of intermittent thing throughout the day. There's not necessarily a specific time where I go and sit, okay, now I have to pray for an hour. It's more a continual kind of thing.
That's biblical. Paul says pray continually, and he's not saying be in a perpetual prayer meeting. I think it's just, as you're saying, as we're living life and encountering issues, we're bringing them before the Lord in an act of dependency.
I think I've gotten to the point where I'll sometimes just be praying and I wouldn't even realize I started, and which isn't bad. This year, because I'm not doing calls, it's a bit more structured again than what it was the last 2 years before that. So there is a bit more time to have your daily devotions in the morning, because you're not in a rush and you actually get home in the afternoon, so the evening you can do the same. So I must say this year it's a lot more structured than it was the 2 years before that. But
the point is, in a year or two you could be back in a different clinical space where it's
again, I'm going to say, like you said, it comes back to the time management. You can find those kind of quiet moments in the day where you can, even if you pray for 5 minutes, it doesn't have to be an hour-long prayer, where you can utilize that. Even like I said, the praying for me was a bit easier because you can just do it. You don't have a physical thing that you need to be reading or holding to be able to pray. Which I would say that 2 years, like 2018, 2019, my Bible knowledge was a bit more shaky, or like not as strong as it was before, because you don't have as much time to physically sit and read the Bible. But I don't think it necessarily has to impact your faith and the strength of your faith. You still kind of manage to work around it.
Yeah, it's still in there.
Yeah.
It's, the things learned years and decades ago are still being internalized and drawn from. I'll come to that. That's an important issue. We want to chase that rabbit as well. I think this is a crucial aspect of this conversation. I think certainly for anybody younger that's coming through the study process, young professionals, hear what David's saying. What I'm about to share, I've shared in a number of different contexts, but I'll throw it out here on the record as well. I was struck a number of years ago by hearing Don Carson, who's probably one of the foremost theologians of our era, just speaking on this issue. It was a Q&A when he was out in the country. D.A. Carson travels extensively, and he was asked the question, what's your devotional life like? And he pretty much said he's learned the art of using those snatches of time. Might be international travel. You need to wake up early in a hotel room, grab a quick buffet breakfast, get into a taxi or a bus and get to an airport and so forth. And this issue of I'm going to 5:30 every morning, I'm going to spend in prayer is just not feasible. But what he said is he learned on those airport benches and on flights and wherever to just maximize those times in terms of reading and prayer. So I think there's a flexibility. I think there's great value in regularity, but we don't want to turn it into a legalism. In fact, just in terms of Bible reading, I think I don't personally do it because I drive short distances, but go and have a chat with Chris de Kock, one of our elders. Chris, in terms of just his movement around Gauteng and out to the mines and so forth and various areas, will often put audio Bibles on and just utilize those long car trips on his own, in a sense of just, you can get through multiple chapters and even kind of shorter books and that kind of thing, just in terms of hearing the word rather than actually sitting down and reading. And it's the different ways that we can manage that, which is helpful. So thank you. You touched on something in terms of just worldview and equipping. I think even an earlier statement of those within the medical profession might be more prone in terms of what they're seeing to question and grapple with issues. Can we just go down that, I don't know if it's a side alley or a main alley, but it's an important alley. In the youth ministry spectrum, we usually recognize that there's some key or some critical points between primary school and secondary schooling has the potential for some fallout, but particularly between secondary schooling and tertiary is a major fallout space. You look at your kind of 18, 19-year-olds, and the issue largely is worldview. You're coming out of a structured home, ministry, family context, and in the space of tertiary study, you've been exposed to a whole lot of stuff that you never heard before and never read before. And it could be, this is not exclusively the case, but certainly maybe within the medical, paramedical fields, kind of an evolutionary worldview. Darwinism might feature even in terms of some of the biological stuff. Certainly within the sciences, a very rationalistic worldview. Within the humanities and the arts programs, just exposure to a whole lot of different philosophies and political worldviews and so forth. And somebody who's not grounded is going to flounder and drown. If their faith is not rock solid, getting in there, the assault of those different philosophies and worldviews is potentially very, very damaging, which is why we sometimes see such a high fallout away from the church and the faith, because there just wasn't a grounding. Talk to me about your experience. What kept you, not to say there might not have been a wobble along the way, but just sane, and what was already in place to guide you through the exposures and stuff? You've mentioned Marion and campus and so Campus Crusade and so forth, but anything else?
I think even before varsity, we had quite a good teaching of foundations when we were part of Fish as well. So I think for us, I'm speaking now for youth from our church specifically, we had a strong foundation going into a tertiary environment. So even if something came, you kind of had a fallback where you're like, okay, I see what you're saying or what the situation is, but I still have the teachings that we were taught during high school about the core principles of the gospel and the Bible, and just relying on that and leaning on that. I think for us as well, I had quite a few discussions with you even in high school about the whole evolution thing as well, and how to approach answering exam questions, and they want you to say it is this and it is that, and I'm thinking, but do you not rather say it could have been that, maybe possible?
Yep.
I think one of the striking things for me in first year was towards the end in the biology classes, the one lecturer came in, and it's the first lecture we had with him, and the first thing he said was, if you don't believe in evolution, then you're dumb. And I was like, can you really say that to people who are sitting in a university classroom? I mean, you're clearly smart enough to get into the class.
It's making assumptions.
Saying that someone's dumb just because they don't agree with something that you think is true, I think it speaks more to his own kind of worldview and ability to argue different points than it does to the people in his class. With regards to different worldviews that you get, I mean, varsity is a big mixing pot of cultures and religions and backgrounds.
I mean, you see the syncretism and the pluralism in a very real way, almost daily.
Yes. There, I think it's the way you approach it. I think you must still be open-minded, so still listen to what the people are saying, listen to the discussions, but for me, I take everything with a pinch of salt. So if someone says something, I'm like, okay, but that's just you saying it. I haven't really heard more about the topic. And one of my kind of skills that I use when I'm speaking with someone, if I don't know enough about a topic, I don't tend to comment on the topic, because whatever I'm going to say is going to be more out of ignorance than anything else.
The very last verse in Proverbs 17 has become our life verse. Even a fool is considered wise when he keeps quiet. Shut up and sit in the corner. You can't go wrong. You know?
Yes. I mean, that doesn't mean... I would encourage you to actually get involved in discussions and debates. I wouldn't really call them arguments. Because it's good to hear the other viewpoints. Because it gives you more of an understanding when you deal with people from that background. This is more or less what they believe in, this is what they think, how they approach things, and it makes it easier to engage with them because you kind of already have a background on how they do things, so you know how to approach certain topics and aspects. I think once we switched over to med school, the problem we started having it was more with like the small children, if you have children who get sick, and especially the ones with cancer and things like that. The common thing that people throw at you is, how can you say God is loving and caring, and then he does this to a child who is innocent? And I think the problem I had trying to convey to them is saying, but no one's really innocent, because you're not born pure, and then somewhere along the line you get corrupted. You're born sinful. So anything that happens is a result of that. The child wasn't more deserving of a healthy life than an adult per se, because we're all born sinful. I think one of the striking moments I remembered from 5th year was when we did obstetrics. So we had to deliver all our babies, and the first one I had, unfortunately, was stillborn. And I didn't realize you still have to weigh the baby and measure the baby, even though it's a stillborn. And so that was my job. And I just remember, as I'm walking with the baby, all I could think was, I don't understand why the baby died, but God knows. And I just had that calm. Like, I was still distraught, because I mean, you're not used to having dead babies, and I can still picture the mom's face and the crying, but I just had this calm thinking, it's not for me to decide, it's not in my control. I don't know why God lets it happen, but I mean, he's just, he doesn't just do things for no reason. And I think throughout med school, from that point, even now to when I'm working, that like when I'm doubting, I always get thrown back to that specific memory. And I'm thinking, but it's not for me to know why someone gets sick, why someone has cancer, why person A gets cured and person B doesn't. I think a part of it that helps me is because I do have faith. I think for someone who's not a Christian, I think it's a bit more difficult. I don't know how you get through the work personally if you don't have some sort of belief system or faith system, because it would just seem highly unfair if there isn't some sort of meaning behind. I'm not saying there's meaning per se, but like someone who's in charge of things that's happening. Like for us, God is in charge of anything that happens, whether you get better or not, which gives me the comfort. It's still unnerving, and it's still something that sticks with you, death and disease, but I have a more sense of calm about it, thinking, okay, well, I might not understand why it's happening or what's going on, but at least I know God is in control of it, and it's not for me to know per se why something happened. But
well, it goes to that verse in Proverbs, the name of the Lord is a high tower that the righteous can run into in times of trouble. And I think what the verse is saying is that we actually find our rest and our security in the name of God, which is really is the totality of absolutely everything that He essentially is. The way you're engaging with me here is you're taking it back to doctrine. What I know about God, what I know about His person, what I know about His plans, as best we can.
Yeah.
And just finding rest in the unchanging nature of who He is. But without that foundation, in a sense, the thinking would just fall apart.
Yeah.
So I think it's incumbent on us to know truth, which shapes worldview, which leads me to another angle, if I may, just in terms of the ethical space. I think healthcare professions are probably more acutely on the ethical coalface than maybe some others. It's not to say that accountants wouldn't have some ethical issues when they're crooking the books, and car mechanics in terms of overbilling and so forth. I mean, we recognize that ethics are part and parcel of our lives. But you're dealing with people, you're dealing with healthcare, you're dealing with hard decisions to be made in terms of life and death. Family members who might have different expectations in terms of the way clinical care is being afforded. What shapes your ethical approach in the midst of just day-to-day engaging with these issues and decision-making?
So for me, a lot of it is just how I would treat the person. Everything that I'm trying to decide if it is an ethical issue comes back to my faith. So firstly, if it's not God honoring, is it ethical?
Yeah, good question.
So if I can tell myself this isn't going to bring any glory to God, then don't do it. It's easy to say that, more difficult to apply it in context. I think the biggest one people always throw at us is like, oh, if someone comes to you and they want an abortion, what are you going to do? Legally speaking, for us at least in South Africa, we do have kind of a fallback where you can say, I don't do abortions because of my faith or my beliefs, but legally you have to refer them to someone else who is willing to do it. That's still an issue I struggle with a little bit, because I feel, yes, it's not me doing it, but I'm still enabling it to happen. So you kind of have a comfort that it's not me making the sin, but the issue is still there, that it is still being committed. Other ethical things, a lot of it for me is just where I've had people say, no, but you seem to be going an extra mile, whereas in my mind it's just you doing kind of just a basic thing. I don't see it as some extraordinary task or thing that I'm doing. I feel I've been enabled, or I'm in a position where I can help, and God has put me there. How can I use this to the best of my abilities, even if it's just explaining to someone what's happening, which is also kind of bordering on the ethical ground. It's not per se something that people would think is an ethical issue, but where someone needs to go in for a procedure. If you don't explain to them what's going to happen, what's the risk. Personally, I think that's unethical, because now the patient's making decisions not based on all the information that's available to them. It's more a pressured kind of thing. If you don't sign this consent, you're going to die, or you're going to lose your foot, or whatever.
What's manipulative?
Yes, which would breach the grounds of ethics. And again, taking like 2 minutes to explain to them everything, I don't see why people struggle with that. Personally, I don't understand it. But a lot of it for me comes down to, if I can at least show them, you know, God put me here for a reason. I don't necessarily tell them, you know, I'm here because God made me a doctor. But I'm trying to use the position in a way that best honors Him. And by honoring God, you don't need to tell people, I'm doing this for God. I think it's what we had in the sermon as well, where, I mean, it's still public, but your motivation is in secret. You're not necessarily showing everyone why my motivation is God.
Sure.
For me, it's more just thinking, okay, the more I do it, maybe someone will notice and they'll come and approach you and start asking, why are you like that? Why do you do things like that? And that opens the conversation too. But God is the reason. Yeah,
so I mean, the point is you're not there to evangelize, you're there to treat. But if you look at the verse in Matthew 5, let your light so shine before men that others may see your good deeds and so glorify your Father who is in heaven.
Yeah.
The point is, a life well lived is actually going to be pointing people in the direction of God and the gospel.
Yeah.
And,
I do think we have quite a few opportunities actually for ministry as well. So, I mean, we deal with people who are chronically ill and terminally ill, and the opportunity does arise where you can actually sit with them and say, listen, can I pray for you? How do you feel?
Sure.
Because a lot of them are scared, and I don't think it's taking advantage of the situation, but I do think if you're scared, you're more open to hearing things about the gospel, because it does give that security, and it makes it easier to share with people because of that. And I mean, I've had a few patients that I've prayed with, just because the opportunity was there.
Good opportunity.
And you saw it and you took it. So it is available to minister. But again, like you said, I don't think my job at the hospital isn't that of a missionary.
Yep.
My first priority is to treat you. And if the opportunity arrives to also do ministry, great.
And we praise God for those opportunities that come about. Sure. I just want to pursue a slightly different angle, spinning off from that. We had a fascinating discussion at Friday morning, Oaks of Righteousness, a couple of months ago, I can't remember now. We've been working through John Piper's book, The Corona, or Christ and the Coronavirus, which is really helpful just to bring a biblical worldview to how we see Corona and so forth, the sovereignty of God, justice of God, a wake-up call in terms of sin and judgment and so forth. But what Piper does in that, about halfway through, is he pokes and prods into the issue of life and death. And the one chapter particularly does open up the discussion in terms of the fact that we're not our own, we've been bought with a price, therefore glorify God with your body. The Lord owns us, we're redeemed, we're His to do with as He wants, and so forth. In fact, there's a particular quote, I just trying to finally get my crib notes again here. And if we go to Romans 14, verse 7 and 8, for example, Paul writes, for none of us lives for ourselves alone, and none of us dies for ourselves alone. If we live for the Lord. And here's the crunch. And if we die for the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord, right? The New City Catechism, in the very first question, asked the question, what is our only hope in life and death? And the response that they gave was that we are not our own, but belong both body and soul, both in life and death, to God and to our Savior, Jesus Christ. Now, I give that to you by way of a lengthy intro. I just wanted to pick your brain. Now, I think that I'd love to have a broader discussion with some others on this at a point in time as well. Has life potentially become too much of an idol, and I'm talking particularly for a believer.
Yeah.
We're in South Africa. Let's assume where we are at in Randburg, in the northern suburbs. We've got exposure to pretty much good healthcare, even in the state spaces, certainly in the private space, etc. There are treatments, there are machines, there's technologies, there's and so forth. Have we lost, to some degree, a sense of the fact that glorifying God through suffering and through death may actually be part of His plan and His purpose? And we park that and pursue life with this frenzy of activity and treatments and money. It's a hard question, but I'd be curious to hear your thinking. Dig a hole for yourself.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my thoughts in order. I'm going to start personally. I don't think there's a problem with seeking out health services if you do have a medical problem.
Correct.
I think God put the health services there for a reason. It's not just there to look at and to say, yes, I want it, no, I don't want it. And if it's there, why not use it? Because at the same time, if you're saying, but it's God's plan maybe for me to suffer and ultimately end in death, at the same time, I can say, but is it not God's plan for you to seek out that medical service? You're still suffering. I'm not saying you have not having the disease, you're not suffering. But He has placed the option there for intervention. It's not to say the intervention is going to work. So you might still end up actually dying. But I don't necessarily see anything inherently wrong with seeking out the medical intervention to try and get better. Because at the same time, I think you also mentioned now, we still need to look after our bodies because it's not our body, it belongs to God.
Yeah, it's the temple of the Holy Spirit.
So if I do get a disease and I don't go and try and find help to make it better, you can then argue, okay, but I'm not looking after this body, that's not mine. I think the question would become more pertinent if it's someone who can't access healthcare. And in that point going, okay, well then maybe it's God's plan that they suffer without any intervention and resulting in death. But I don't think you can 100% say that I mustn't go look for intervention. Because maybe it's not God's plan. I mean, we don't know God's plan anyway to begin with. So for me saying, no, I mustn't go to the doctor because it's not God's plan, in a sense is also not an accurate statement, because how do you know it's not God's plan for me to go and get
I'd agree. I think in His providence at this point in time, there's obviously in varying degrees across various areas of the planet, but there's healthcare, which needs to be pursued and certainly made use of. One doesn't want to get into the situation where it's almost too super spiritual of, I'm going to sit back and pursue nothing, and if the Lord heals, He heals, and if He doesn't, He doesn't, without the use of legitimate medication and treatment plans that are available, which I think sadly some do.
I think the thing is, we make more and more advances every year, and life expectancy is becoming longer and longer, and functionality is extended, where even if you're 90, you can still be a functional, contributing member of society and not just sit in an old age home per se. But I wouldn't necessarily say trying to pursue that is making an idol of life. Obviously, again, it comes down to your motivations. Why do I want to live that long? Do you get to a certain point where you're thinking, okay, well, I mean, I've lived a full life, and again, not saying I'm not seeking any medical intervention, but if the point comes where it says, okay, but now you have to make a decision, you have to get this operation or you'll die, and if you get the operation, there's still a high chance that you will die, then you can start arguing, okay, but is it worth pursuing the intervention or not? Because even if the intervention has a 10% chance of success, is it then worth it? I mean, is there anything more that I can gain from being alive? Anything more that I can contribute from being alive, or is this the point where I can make the decision, okay, you know, I'm comfortable with how long I've lived, with what I've done. There's no point in me really pursuing anything further if it might not even work.
Sure. Well, I think I touched on this in a recent Winddown with Des Henry, just from a missional point of view, not from a medical point of view. But I think I was just curious to hear your perspectives there as well. In that, are we in the space that we're in, suburbia, comfort, medical care? I've got my doctors, I've got my hospitals, I've got my local pharmacist on hand. Potentially holding on to those creature comforts and not saying, Lord, use me wherever you want to. And if that's going to involve suffering and affliction and death, so be it. I'm willing to forego that for the cause of Christ and the gospel, as opposed to, no, I've got to hold on to that and preserve my I don't know, I'm battling with, maybe we're too consumed with I'm okay to glorify God with my life, but the possibility that actually He could be honored through adverse circumstances doesn't seem to often feature in our thinking.
Yeah. I think comfort at the moment is a lot more accessible to us than you would maybe think of the people in the Bible. They didn't have all the things we have. They didn't have the technology and everything that we have at our disposal. Again, people 100 years from now are going to look back at us and think, wow, I mean, we were very primitive in the 2020s. Again, not that there's anything wrong with it, but you must also be careful that we also have common sense. God didn't just make us people to follow blindly and just do things without thinking it through. Because you can also go to the extreme where you think, okay, but I have to die for God, which isn't necessarily true. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with dying for God, but where people tend to think, okay, but if I don't do that, then there's something wrong. So I am suffering, let me just keep on suffering and dying because, you know, because in a sense that can also become more of what do people think of me instead of God. So your intentions are to tell people that I'm going to die for God, but the attention is falling on you and being taken from God. So it's I don't know, it's a tricky question to have. I don't think you'll get an answer that satisfies both sides.
I'd agree with you, and I think it's we're just scratching the surface here. It was probably an unfair one to throw, but I think we just need to grapple with that. And I think just be mindful when we spoke earlier about prayer for healthcare providers, either medical or whatever, to pray in terms of just wisdom in decision making in these areas, because while the Bible contains everything we need for life and godliness, sometimes the application of that in the murkiness is a challenge. And particularly, as David's saying, as technology is increasing and the resources and the means of treatment and surgical interventions and so forth escalate, certainly in the first world, that is thrusting us into situations individually, but it's thrusting medical professionals into situations that they weren't in 10 or 15 or 20 or 100 years ago. Certainly the medical facilities available in biblical times are so far removed from some of the decision-making challenges. So I think we just need to be praying for you guys for wisdom to navigate those issues. I mean, I think the clearer ones, and I say clearer, not crystal clear, but would be kind of your termination of pregnancy and euthanasia and so forth. But in the midst of that, even beyond that, there's just a murky quagmire in terms of when and how and what treatment plans and technologies would be appropriate. That needs to be navigated. And I think, you know, you're going to look back in 30, 40 years' time as a professional going, even during my professional career, those questions have surfaced so much more. So, be in prayer for them in that way. I don't know, thoughts on that?
I think, there's a few that are more clear-cut, and it's easier to make a decision about what is the right way or wrong way. I think we've had a discussion as well that I brought to the student in a final, I think it was 2017, not sure, where we had that patient that was genetically
your intersex
male.
one,
Yes, but
I remember.
biologically and physically she was female, but it was because of a genetic abnormality. And that case, I mean, we had discussions about it afterwards as well, where there's no clear-cut answer for how you should approach it. Because I think the way it went at the student, and it was, she's been brought up as a girl. Biologically, she's a female.
And she was married.
Yes.
And her husband thought she was female.
Yes.
But,
and she thinks she's a female.
yeah.
And the whole family, I mean, the whole community. And the only point where we started investigating was because she wasn't having her periods and she couldn't get pregnant. And at that point,
Yeah.
when we did the scans, we found out that she doesn't have a uterus. And she's never been for a hysterectomy. So, I mean, organs don't just disappear. Where our consultant actually brought up the topic saying, okay, what do you do now? Because now you can do the test and find out the genotype that she's XY, but now do you tell her, listen, you're not a female, in fact, and the reason you can't get pregnant is because you're a male and something went wrong with your genetics and this is why you look like a female, but you're not.
Yeah.
I mean, the topic came up, now if she's male, does she need to divorce the husband? Because now the issue of same-sex marriage comes in, then the issue of divorce comes in as well. I mean, it's an issue that I'm saying that they might not have to deal with that in biblical times because obviously they didn't have the investigations that we do today, so they would never have known about the situation. But now trying to apply biblical evidence and living to that scenario is
But it's compounded. I mean, it's not just an intersect of medicine and Christianity. I think in that particular issue, there's sociological issues, there's legal issues.
I mean, it's a whole life.
You know, there's community, and particularly if the community doesn't understand, if they're in a sense rural and potentially just don't have the wherewithal in terms of understanding the issues. I think a lot of that particular issue has probably been made more public through Caster Semenya and the whole intersex issue. So I think our country's a lot more au with that.
Yes.
But to handle that is a quagmire.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to be praying, just for wisdom to navigate those challenges.
Because I think if you look from a world viewpoint, you might say it's easy to handle it. Just don't, I mean, sexuality from a worldly viewpoint it's a mixed thing. You're born the way you are. Those kind of statements get thrown around.
Or what you choose to be.
Yes. Whereas from a biblical viewpoint, it's not that simple.
Sure.
We don't necessarily get born a certain way. I mean, again, our science might not be advanced enough to pick up things like that, but from the viewpoint that they had in biblical times to what we have now, I'm not saying you can't apply the biblical knowledge. I just think we're faced with scenarios that they weren't aware of at the time, just because we have better ways of investigating things now. So from a biblical viewpoint, it's difficult to approach the situation because it's someone's life, but you must also weigh up, is there any sin issues? How do I approach this? Because now it's not just her involved, it's the husband involved, it's other family members involved. I think we tend to look at things very closed off instead of seeing, well, there's actually a lot more moving pieces than just this one issue.
Sure.
I don't think we ever came to a conclusion.
No, I don't think it's an easy one. But I suppose you we'll just bring it back to first principles. You know, how do I love God and love my neighbor in a sense through that as well? What's the most loving thing for her and for that family? And in a sense, maybe the historicity does help, because in the first century or even prior, without the imaging and without the technology, that individual would have been regarded as female and would have carried on living life in that way. And I think it's probably where it needs to, in a sense, rest. But I know there are different angles to that as well. But I think we certainly have got grounds for lots of interesting discussion on ethical issues, and I'd love to have you back again at some other stage to poke and prod into some issues on that as well. got an email from one of our folk just about 48 hours ago to say, why don't you tackle the issue of suffering in terms of Winddown? And I think that's just such a crucial issue. We've alluded to it along the way, but how does a believer suffer in a way that is God honoring and handle health issues and affliction and so forth? So we'll see how we go with that and bring some biblical perspective to that. But yeah, David, maybe just do wind down the wind down if I can, and bring it back to some personal discussion at the end as well. You're gifted vocally. I mean, I think we know that we've been blessed by that as a church. So thank you for your years of faithful service, even in terms of the music ministry. But in terms of songs, if I had to throw it at you, if there's one or two songs that are particularly important or crucial or helpful or encouraging for you, what would you pick and why?
I think I had the same discussion with you when I had to pick the songs for the recordings as well.
Go and listen to the recordings on the YouTube channel.
I don't know, initially I was told 3 and then I couldn't narrow it down.
Well, that's Owen's fault, but he just kept changing the goalposts.
I got stuck at 6, but there were a few that I felt like, that I couldn't leave out. I think We Are a Moment is one of them. I think for me it just put into perspective how we're actually nothing. Kind of, if you look at in the face of eternity, you can't even measure what we are in that span. And it put for me into perspective the awesomeness of God and how big He is, and then us. I mean, even in the song, we're a moment, we're dust, we don't, there's nothing. Yeah. And He's eternal. And I don't know, it made me more awe-inspired, if I can say that, of just how big He is. Sure. For me, a lot of the songs that have meaning for me is more the ones where it shows how we can't do anything for ourselves. And everything that we have in terms of faith and belief is fully reliant on God. There isn't anything that we can do at all to earn favor, to earn salvation, to do anything in the eyes of God that's actually worthy, if you can use that word. Because the other one that I also said I didn't really want to cut was King of Kings as well. Yeah. And I mean, the chorus there, I don't think you can have better words, where it's like, I can only but bow. Like, there's nothing else for me to do. What can I do? I
live to serve your majesty.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it goes to life purpose, man.
Yeah. And I think one that I recently had from Sovereign Grace Music was, again, just the chorus. Because initially the song starts off with, they're paraphrasing the scripture, but is that where if God has to count the sins of people, there's no one that's going to stand without any sin. And then the chorus just gets into this heartfelt cry of God having mercy on us, and that we don't deserve anything, that we're sinners, but this plea with God to have mercy on us. And I think then, just as knowing the rest of Scripture, is that He actually did have mercy on us, and that cry that you have is actually answered already.
Yeah, that's the nature and the character of God. Grace, mercy, love, and we just cling to those. Where would we be without that?
Yes.
So, Slightly lighter weight, but I know you're not just a good singer, but an artist. We've been blessed by that as well. I think of a couple of holiday clubs with lots of paint being splashed around, and some interesting decor projects that we've done back in the dark mist of time. Do you even remember those?
I do. I just remember that banner with
the side
castles and the Ferris wheel.
Oh, and you spent hours on that. It was meticulous.
Because I drew it wrong the first time.
You sit down from any artist from history. Who would you choose and why for a lunchtime appointment?
I don't really know. I don't have a specific person that I look at their art and I'm like, wow, no one can ever paint as beautiful as that or draw like that.
I painted a tree once. It got into the school calendar.
Which, well, I mean, yeah, I'm sitting,
my autograph.
I'm sitting with you now having a discussion.
Yeah,
for For me personally, art is more just like a way of relaxing and a hobby. So it's not that I'm drawing inspiration from anyone specific. I mean,
Picasso, Dreyer.
well, you have your big names, but I just personally, I wouldn't really have anything to say to them.
So there's no major
Like I'm
influences.
sitting there with them and thinking, okay, well, you drew some really nice artworks, but I don't really want to ask you anything else.
Oh. So nobody really shaped you?
Not really.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I can appreciate art, but my own style is not, I don't paint. So that's kind of maybe where he just.
No, you're a drawer.
Yeah, I like sketching is a lot easier.
Is that even a word?
Colours,
Drawer.
maybe.
Sketch. Let's just stick to sketch.
Yeah, and you don't really know that many famous sketchers. Yeah, and my art is more towards the cartoony kind of light-hearted side, whereas your more famous people are all these serious paintings and all this meaning in the painting.
Well, Zapira needs a sidekick, doesn't he?
Oh, that's true, but I don't have comedy or comedic bones.
Oh, you can bring in some political
Yeah.
commentary there as well. Cool, man. Well, thank you. Thanks for your time. We could go around and around in circles indefinitely, and I think it brings value, but for the sake of everyone watching, they want to get to their dinner, I'm sure. Folk, I trust that was helpful and informative, and there are many areas where we could have gone a lot deeper and so forth, but I just wanted to scratch the surface on that and get your brain juices flowing a little bit as well. But I think the big takeout points to my mind off this is just being prayer for those that we know that are on the coalface in these areas, both in terms of physical protection, but also spiritually, and just for good, godly decision making in the midst of sometimes when those life and death ethical issues need to be made, that there's a the information, the foundations under the surface actually are still in place to actually draw from. So pray for them in that way. But David, thank you. Thanks for coming through.
No problem.
And I should be praying for you at the end, but what I've done as a tradition is ask the victim in the studio to pray. So maybe just pray for us as a local church and ourselves moving forward, and we'll wrap it up in that way, if you would. Thanks.
No, that's fine. Okay. Lord, I thank you that we can come before you today, and that we're able to have discussions like this where we tackle topics that people don't normally think about or deal with, and where we try and find at least some biblical background and foundation to handle them in situations. And I think it's much needed discussion, even if it's just to educate people, and they might not have any discussions like this after this, but at least that they've been exposed to and gets people thinking about scenarios. But I pray for our church especially that we can just engage more like this, even if it's not specifically medical topics, but any topics of daily living. I think there's a lot of things we can learn from the other people in our church, from backgrounds that we don't understand or that we're not exposed to on a daily basis, and just how to tackle different scenarios and approach different people from different viewpoints, and how to have discussions that are based on your truth, and where we can try and minister, even if it is just through normal discussions with people. Lord, I also pray that you would just keep us safe as a church, even in the midst of this pandemic, like you've already done. We will just exercise caution, but at the same time try and emphasize worship of you, Lord, and learning more about you and being exposed to your word in the most efficient and safe ways possible. I think it's a scenario that we weren't expecting, and that you can't really train or properly prepare for, but that you would just guide us to make the most of it and to continue to put you first and try and assist the people in the church with as much biblical help that we can, that we won't lose any of that momentum and strength that we would have with normal services, Lord. I pray specifically for our leadership, because it is a challenging time, I think, for all the ministry areas, where we're trying to engage and we're trying to still have a semblance of normal church structure and activities happening, and it's quite difficult to try and keep everyone involved at the same time when you're not allowed to have over a certain amount of people. You need to have certain distances between people. makes things difficult, but I pray that you would just give them guidance on how to lead your people, Lord, and to do it in the best way and most God-honoring way possible. It's difficult, and it's easy in circumstances like this where we lose touch or focus with certain members of the church just because it's more difficult to reach out to them or for them to even come and approach the church leadership or the church itself, Lord, that you would just guide us on how to do it in the most efficient way, and for people not being able to come, that we can find ways to make it more convenient or to help them out in situations like that, even if it is just with phone calls or emails, that we just keep in touch. I think it's important, and we've took it for granted before, just being here together as a membership in physical contact with each other. And now that we've been missing it, we kind of realized how important it is. And you also say in your word that we do need to fellowship. It's an important part of our belief system and how to encourage people and to grow from people. And with the recent months, it's been a bit more difficult, but I think we're getting more and more efficient as we go on. And that's thanks to you, Lord, for guiding us in that way. I pray that you would just keep us safe, as safe as we can be, and that you would just guide us in what we do going forward, and to support as much as we can, and with the abilities that we have, those in the congregation that need the support. Amen.
Amen. David, thank you. Thanks for coming through. And folk, hook in again next Sunday, God willing, for the next exciting edition of Weekend Winddown. And have a good week, sustained by God's grace.